Good afternoon. My name is Rob Clemens. I'm the Change and Communications Manager at EcoCommons Australia. And EcoCommons is building a world-class environmental modeling platform. And we're doing that with the help of 9 partner organizations. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about how CSIRO's impact framework is changing our thinking at EcoCommons on what we're going to do. So first, I just want to highlight that the platform will be launching in November 2022. And EcoCommons has a vision for Australian practitioners and researchers to use trusted, world-leading ecological and environmental modeling tools to protect and restore the planet. So that little blue dot in the corner of your screen is a place that's full of life, and in just 200 years, we're starting to put the life on our planet at risk. So our mission is to be the platform of choice to analyze and model ecological and environmental challenges. And those challenges are growing. So we need to bring together the best available data and apply the best available tools to solve those challenges. Now, fortunately, BCCVL is another platform that's going to come under the EcoCommons umbrella, and they've been doing this kind of work for years. So they do things like generating species distribution models, which are maps of where species occur, and predict how those distributions of species are going to change under climate change. The map on the upper right reflects sea level rise predictions, which is going to impact coastal environments around the globe. The 2 maps on the bottom highlight the climatic niche of the breeding habitat of the Pacific golden plover, which is pictured there. And that's a bird that flies each year from northern Russia to Australia. And there you can see in northern Russia, its breeding habitat almost entirely disappears in the map on the right if under climate change scenarios. So that bird is going to have to get used to an environment that is completely different to the one it's currently using. And EcoCommons wants to make an impact towards mitigating those kinds of changes that are coming and identify which changes are going to be most severe. So CSIRO defines impact as an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, or the environment. So kind of that triple bottom line thinking. And its impact is beyond those contributions to academic knowledge, or in our case, how to build a powerful platform. And CSIRO's impact framework looks a lot like a lot of other planning frameworks. You look at the inputs that you have. So what kinds of resources and staff do you have available? What kinds of activities are you going to do? What kind of work and what are you going to build? And then ultimately the output is the launch of the platform for users. And when I first joined the EcoCommons team, I was primarily focused on maximizing the number of users that were going to be using the platform by the time we launched. And I didn't put a lot of thought into outcomes or impact because those things I have much less control over. I don't have a lot of control over how widely the platform is cited in the scientific literature or what kinds of environmental impacts the platform might provide. But this framework really helped me understand that you can plan for those things being more likely to occur. And the other thing to bring up about this framework is it's presented here as a nice linear framework, but in fact there's feedback loops throughout this. Sometimes you have to go back 2, 3, or 4 steps. But I think it's helpful to think of this framework in a linear way. So if we think on why would we want to focus on impact? And I'd argue that if you're focusing on that light on a distant hill, you're much more likely to achieve the outcomes that are required to get to that light. So it just focuses your efforts. And it's increasingly required by funders. It's also gives you sort of a baseline to judge how you're doing. So if you're aimed in one direction, you can look at what's working well and what's not working well towards achieving those ultimate goals. So it gives you a nice frame of reference. If you're able to demonstrate impact, it has a lot more power in terms of reaching more audiences. It really resonates with audiences to be able to demonstrate impact. And finally, if you're focused on that distant light on the hill, you're much less likely to be distracted by other things that won't get you there. So you're more likely to allocate your time and resources in a more targeted way, right? And there's a number of steps that we've identified that EcoCommons needs to take to achieve impact. First is to establish the purpose and audiences and then prioritize those things. A lot of that's been done already. Then we need to identify the impacts and impact pathways. How are we going to achieve those impacts, and what specific impacts do we want to achieve? Do we want to maximize the protected area state within Australia? We've got a good group of governance boards to help us decide on what exactly the impacts we want to achieve are. And then we need to identify the data and methods needed to evaluate how well we're tracking towards those impacts. And it takes quite a bit of data to do something like a cost-benefit analysis. So it's useful to think about those things early. And once we've identified how we're going to measure things, we also have to keep in mind that we might be working with an agency that are doing wonderful things. And we need to separate the wonderful things that agency would have done without our platform and the additional wonderful things that they were able to do with our platform. We subtract the costs and we get that net benefit. And then we need to proportionally allocate that benefit among the many partners who we rely on to do what we do. So we can't claim all of that benefit. We have to divide it up with our partners, and we need to talk to them about how we're going to do that. So EcoCommons has already done a lot of this, but initially they used a slightly different framework. So it's called program logic, and it takes similar steps. So it looks at the problems and the needs, identifies the inputs, activities, outputs, then short, mid, and long-term outcomes. So that framework produced medium and long-term outcomes that EcoCommons wants to achieve. So in 2 years, we want EcoCommons to be cited widely in the scientific literature. We want the mobile architecture of EcoCommons to be shared widely across digital infrastructure. We want EcoCommons to be integrated within universities and agencies. And in 5 years, we want the information that's coming out of EcoCommons to be foundational in refining environmental policies, in deciding where and when to take environmental actions, to drive environmental investment. And as with all digital infrastructure, those powerful and fast tools we're building, we want to really be able to quantify the cost and time savings that those tools provide. And finally, we want to kind of upskill the digital workforce. So we've got more people who can use these powerful tools. It does take some training to use some of them. And throughout this process, we want to just focus on demonstrating value and communicating that to all our stakeholders. So EcoCommons, again, we have these legacy platforms that are coming under the EcoCommons umbrella, and they already have a sound audience, and who are mostly university folks, researchers, and students. But we've also identified that we want to talk to decision makers and try and get them on board. And if we have time, we'd like to reach out to private organizations and NGOs. But there's a lot of groups here. And as a comm person, there's no way I can reach all of those individually. I'm going to have to use some broad communications channels and hope that some of those people that I'm reaching out to get back to me. But what if we focus more on impacts? Does our audience change? So regardless of what we do, the university sector is tried and true with the services we provide. So we'll continue to engage with that audience. But which additional audiences would generate more impact with our tools? So what if we target advanced or intermediate users who use these kinds of tools daily? And among those groups who are using tools like this regularly, which jurisdictions or specific departments or groups are creating the most impact or are likely to create the most impact? And again, we have governing boards that can help us identify those pathways. And that's really so far how this framework has really changed our thinking. We're going to continue with broad channel communications, but we're also going to invest in targeted communications to those organizations that can create the most impact. We're going to try and engage them in platform testing. So over the next year, they can mold what that platform becomes. They'll have a real say in what's being created. Their needs will more likely be met because we'll be engaging with them over the next year. And that's likely going to change the kind of training material we have to provide. And it'll give us an opportunity. We have a scientific advisory committee, which is very switched on. It'll give them an opportunity to provide advice on how these user groups can do better science, how they can do their day-to-day routines more efficiently and more effectively. And the other thing that this framework has highlighted is that we need to consult with our stakeholders in those user groups early and often. It's very hard to come up with a quantitative cost-benefit analysis at the last minute. You need to flag what kinds of data you need a long way in advance. And even for qualitative data, if we're going to run surveys or interviews, they're going to be much more effective if we tell people what to expect. So we do have a challenge in that we launch in November 2022 and funding runs out in March of 2023. So that only gives us a few months to demonstrate impact, which is not ideal. But if you look at this graph, we're fairly convinced in those first few months we'll be able to identify, we'll get on board the early adopters. And if we plan well for it, we should be able to identify the actual outcomes that they can produce and then project what the anticipated outcomes and impacts will be. And that kind of work's been done by CSIRO. So we have a good framework to use to guide us there. So program logic and impact frameworks, they provide a proven pathways to sustainability. You know, having those goalposts, you know, where you're aiming really helps. But I would argue focusing on impact produces a much more powerful narrative, especially for funders and potential investors and your stakeholders. If you can really tell them what the return on investment was, how much money was saved, how much time was saved, how many, in our case, how many environmental assessments were improved by using this new powerful tool. So again, CSIRO has a ton of information about this. If you want to learn more about it, we encourage you to visit the link at the bottom of this slide and get to understand some of the great work that they've done in this arena. And finally, I just want to thank the many partner organizations who give me a wonderful reason to get out of bed every day. And thank you for listening.